Rick Sanchez is never trapped. This is the first and most important fact about him. No matter where he is, no matter how dire the situation appears, there is always an exit within reach. A portal gun on his hip, a ship nearby, a contingency hidden inside another contingency. Rick lives in a permanent state of readiness, not to fight, not to endure, but to leave. Leaving is his most reliable skill. At first glance, this looks like freedom. Rick can move between universes as easily as others move between rooms. He is not bound by geography, law, time, or even mortality in the conventional sense. When something becomes inconvenient, dangerous, or emotionally uncomfortable, Rick does not have to solve it. He can simply go. This ability defines his relationship with the multiverse, but it also defines his relationship with himself. Rick does not escape danger alone. He escapes meaning, responsibility, and attachment with the same efficiency. The portal gun is not just a tool for travel. It is a mechanism of avoidance. Rick's addiction is not to alcohol, chaos, or power. It is to escape. Escape, for Rick, is not a response to crisis. It is a default state. He builds his life around the assumption that permanence is a mistake. Staying is a liability. Commitment is a trap that closes slowly and kills quietly. The moment something begins to demand continuity, Rick prepares an exit. This pattern repeats everywhere he goes. He leaves planets before consequences mature. He abandons universes once they become complicated. He exits relationships the moment they require accountability. Rick frames this behavior as intelligence. Why stay and suffer when a better option exists elsewhere? Why repair what can be replaced? Why endure when escape is cheap? In a finite world, this logic would collapse quickly. In an infinite one, it thrives. The multiverse enables Rick's addiction by making escape endlessly available. There is always another version of the same place without the same pain. Another timeline where things went differently. Another family that looks familiar but does not carry the same history. Rick does not need to confront loss. He can root around it. This rooting becomes habit, and habit becomes identity. Rick stops evaluating whether escape is necessary. He assumes it is. Staying feels dangerous not because the situation is unmanageable, but because staying would require him to feel what he has avoided: grief, regret, responsibility. Rick's backstory is marked by loss, but what defines him more is not the loss itself, but what he learned from it. He learned that attachment creates vulnerability, that love anchors you to a single outcome, that caring narrows your options until escape becomes impossible. So Rick chooses breadth over depth. He spreads himself across realities rather than sinking into any one of them. He cultivates mobility as a substitute for healing. Instead of processing pain, he outruns it. Instead of integrating loss, he replaces the context in which it occurred. This works. For a while. Rick's intelligence allows him to survive the short-term consequences of this strategy. He avoids stagnation. He avoids entrapment. He avoids the slow suffocation that comes from being stuck in a life that reminds him of what he lost. But avoidance has a cost that cannot be escaped indefinitely. Every time Rick leaves, he reinforces the belief that staying is unsafe. Every successful escape teaches him that departure is the correct response to discomfort. Over time, his threshold for what counts as unbearable drops. What once required catastrophe to trigger escape now requires only inconvenience. Rick does not just flee pain, he flees stillness. Stillness creates space for reflection, and reflection threatens to surface things Rick has buried under motion. As long as he is moving, changing locations, changing universes, changing problems, he does not have to sit with unresolved emotion. Movement becomes anesthesia. This is why Rick is rarely at peace, even in moments of apparent victory. He solves problems brilliantly, dismantles enemies effortlessly, and escapes traps that would destroy anyone else. And yet, the relief never lasts. The satisfaction fades quickly, replaced by restlessness. Rick's escapes do not resolve tension. They reset it. Each reset delays confrontation, but also compounds it. The unresolved feelings do not disappear when Rick leaves a universe. They follow him as patterns. The same conflicts reappear in different forms. The same relationships fracture in familiar ways. The same loneliness returns, unchanged by distance. Rick begins to confuse motion with progress. He believes that because he is not stuck, he is advancing. Because he is not dead, he is succeeding. Because he is not trapped, he is free. But freedom that exists only as the ability to leave is fragile. It depends entirely on never being required to stay. The idea of staying terrifies Rick more than death. Death is final, but staying is continuous. Staying means waking up in the same place with the same people and the same unresolved tensions. Staying means acknowledging that some problems cannot be solved quickly or cleverly. Staying means accepting limits. Rick has built his entire identity around refusing limits. His intelligence gives him leverage over reality, but his addiction to escape prevents him from using that leverage to build anything stable. He can dismantle systems, but cannot sustain them. He can enter lives, but cannot remain present in them. He can save the day, but cannot live the aftermath. Rick's family feels this acutely. He returns to them repeatedly, not because he has overcome his addiction, but because they represent a familiar place to land between escapes. The Smith household is not a commitment. It is a waypoint, a place to rest before leaving again. This is why Rick can appear affectionate and distant in the same moment. He invests just enough to feel anchored, but never enough to be bound. The moment attachment begins to solidify, he destabilizes it through chaos, conflict, or departure. Rick calls this honesty, but it is strategy. By never staying long enough to be fully accountable, Rick preserves the illusion that his exits are justified. He tells himself that the environment was flawed, the people were inadequate, the situation was unsalvageable. These explanations protect him from considering the alternative, that staying might have been painful, but survivable. Rick's addiction to escape also shapes his morality. When you can always leave, consequences become optional. Harm can be reframed as temporary. Damage can be dismissed as belonging to a version of reality you no longer inhabit. This erodes ethical continuity. Rick does not feel evil. He feels unbound. But unbounded action without continuity is indistinguishable from irresponsibility. Rick avoids this conclusion by refusing to stay in the aftermath of his choices. He leaves before the bill arrives. This behavior is rewarded by the multiverse. Rick's escapes work often enough to reinforce themselves. He survives, he finds new challenges, he stays stimulated. The absence of immediate consequences convinces him that escape is not only viable, but optimal. Addiction thrives on reinforcement. Rick's brilliance masks the damage of his habit. A less intelligent being could not sustain this lifestyle. Rick can. That does not make it healthy. It makes it harder to diagnose. Because Rick is never trapped, he never has to confront the possibility that staying might heal something escape never can. He never learns how to remain present through discomfort. He never practices repair. He never builds tolerance for emotional pain. Instead, he perfects departure. In quiet moments, when there is nowhere immediate to go, Rick's restlessness becomes visible. He drinks, he provokes conflict, he creates emergencies, anything to justify movement, anything to avoid stillness. Stillness is where addiction breaks. Rick avoids it at all costs. And so the cycle continues. Escape after escape, universe after universe, problem after problem. Each departure feels like relief. Each arrival feels hollow. The distance traveled grows larger, but the internal landscape remains unchanged. Rick Sanchez is not running from enemies. He is running from the idea that some things cannot be escaped, only endured. And as long as the multiverse keeps offering exits, Rick will keep taking them, convinced that motion is freedom, and unaware that the one place he has never learned to stay is inside himself. For Rick Sanchez, staying does not feel neutral, it feels terminal. The is difficult to understand from the outside because staying is usually framed as safety. Remaining in one place implies shelter, continuity, and the absence of immediate threat. For most people, staying means survival. For Rick, it means something else entirely. It means exposure without exit, pain without distraction, and responsibility without expiration. Staying forces time to do its work. Rick can outrun almost anything except duration. He can dismantle enemies, collapse empires, and bend physical law until it cooperates. What he cannot outthink is the slow accumulation of unresolved feeling. Staying allows that accumulation to surface. Leaving interrupts it. This is why staying feels like death. Not because Rick would stop existing, but because the version of himself that relies on motion would have nothing left to do. Staying would strip away his most reliable defense mechanism and leave him alone with continuity, which is far more threatening to him than annihilation. Death ends pain, staying prolongs it. Rick's history teaches him this lesson early and repeatedly. Loss, when endured rather than escaped, reshapes a person permanently. Rick learned that loving something ties you to a single timeline, a single outcome, a single point of failure. When that point fails, the damage cannot be rerouted. So Rick learned to avoid single points. He distributes himself across realities, identities, and contingencies. He refuses to anchor fully to any one version of events. This distribution makes him resilient in the short term, but it comes at the cost of coherence. Rick is everywhere, but nowhere long enough to settle. Staying would require integration. Integration means allowing past and present to coexist without escape. It means holding grief alongside function, regret alongside competence. Rick avoids integration by fragmenting his life across universes. Each departure resets context, giving him the illusion of starting fresh without actually healing. This illusion is powerful. In a multiverse where replacement is always available, staying appears irrational. Why endure discomfort when a version of reality exists where that discomfort never occurred? Why repair a relationship when another version exists without the damage? Why sit with pain when it can be bypassed? Rick internalizes this logic so deeply that permanence becomes synonymous with failure. If something hurts long enough to demand staying, Rick assumes the situation itself is flawed. The correct response in his mind is to leave before the flaw defines him. This belief is reinforced every time escape works. Rick survives again and again by refusing to stay. The multiverse rewards his departure with novelty, stimulation, and survival. There is no immediate penalty for avoidance. In fact, avoidance often appears optimal. Each successful exit confirms Rick's suspicion that staying would have been a mistake. Addiction thrives when consequences are delayed. Rick's genius delays them indefinitely. Staying also threatens Rick's self-concept. His identity is built around control, adaptability, and superiority. Staying implies surrendering control to time, to relationships, and to outcomes that cannot be engineered. It means accepting that not every variable can be optimized or escaped. Rick equates this acceptance with weakness. In his mind, staying transforms intelligence into passivity. It converts capability into endurance. Rick does not trust endurance. Endurance implies tolerating conditions you cannot change. Rick's entire worldview is predicated on refusing to tolerate anything. This is why mundane domesticity unsettles him. The Smith household is not dangerous in a cosmic sense. It does not threaten Rick's life or intellect, but it demands repetition. The same rooms, the same people, the same unresolved tensions resurfacing daily. Staying in that environment forces Rick to confront patterns rather than isolated problems. Patterns are harder to escape than enemies. An enemy can be destroyed. A pattern requires recognition. Rick avoids recognition by leaving before repetition becomes reflection. The moment he feels the weight of routine, he destabilizes it through chaos or departure. He introduces new variables to prevent the environment from becoming emotionally legible. Legibility is dangerous. If Rick stays long enough to see the same conflicts recur, he might be forced to acknowledge his role in them. He might see that some problems persist not because they are unsolvable, but because he refuses to engage with them beyond crisis management. Staying would expose this truth. And truth, unlike danger, cannot be outgunned. Rick's fear of staying is also tied to mortality in a deeper sense. Death, in Rick's experience, is abstract. He has died, watched himself die, and replaced himself across timelines. Death is an event he can root around. Aging, however, cannot be escaped the same way. Aging requires staying in one body long enough to experience decline. It requires continuity. Rick resists this not by denying time, but by dispersing his sense of self across universes and backups. Staying would force him to inhabit one trajectory fully, including its limitations. That trajectory ends. Rick knows this. Staying means acknowledging that even he is finite in ways he cannot fully override. Leaving allows him to pretend that finitude belongs only to the versions of himself he abandons. Rick's addiction to escape is therefore not about thrill-seeking. It is about refusing to inhabit a single ending. Staying would require Rick to commit to a version of himself that ages, accumulates regret, and eventually disappears. Escape keeps those outcomes theoretical. As long as he is moving, his end feels distant, abstract, someone else's problem. This is why Rick often escalates situations unnecessarily. Escalation creates justification for departure. It transforms staying into an unreasonable demand. By making environments unstable, Rick ensures that leaving appears rational. He does not wait for a reason to go. He creates one. This behavior is not accidental. It is protective. Rick protects himself from staying the way others protect themselves from danger. He associates permanence with suffocation. He associates repetition with decay. He associates stillness with vulnerability. And vulnerability terrifies him more than destruction. Staying would require Rick to accept that some things cannot be fixed immediately, that some wounds heal slowly or not at all, that some relationships demand patience rather than brilliance, that some failures must be lived with rather than corrected. Rick has never practiced this skill. His intelligence has always offered him alternatives. The multiverse enables him to substitute depth with breadth. When one context becomes emotionally demanding, he exits into another. Over time, this trains him to experience any demand for staying as intolerable pressure. Pressure triggers flight. Rick's body reacts to staying the way others react to threat. He becomes restless, irritable, and self-destructive. He drinks more. He provokes conflict. He destabilizes environments that feel too settled. These behaviors are not random. They are withdrawal symptoms. When Rick cannot escape physically, he escapes psychologically. He disengages emotionally, mocks sincerity, and undermines attachment. These strategies serve the same purpose as leaving, preventing permanence from taking hold. Staying would also force Rick to witness the long-term effects of his actions. He avoids aftermath deliberately. He leaves before consequences mature. Staying would mean seeing who suffers, who adapts, and who breaks as a result of his choices. That knowledge would be difficult to compartmentalize. Rick prefers snapshots to narratives. A snapshot can be dismissed. A narrative demands accountability. Staying creates narrative. This is why Rick rarely returns to places he has truly damaged, unless forced. The sight of continuity unsettles him. It reveals that time does not reset when he leaves. Things continue without him, shaped by what he did and did not do. Staying would collapse Rick's belief that departure neutralizes responsibility. It does not. But as long as he leaves, he can pretend it does. Rick's fear of staying is ultimately a fear of being known, not intellectually but emotionally. Staying long enough for someone to understand him would require consistency It would require revealing patterns rather than performances. Rick's performances are brilliant, his patterns are painful. Leaving preserves performance. Staying exposes pattern. This is why Rick oscillates between closeness and disappearance. He allows brief intimacy, then withdraws. He offers moments of connection, then destabilizes them. He gives just enough to feel human without staying long enough to be accountable. Rick believes this balance keeps him safe. It does not. It keeps him restless. The tragedy is that Rick confuses endurance with death because he has never learned how to endure without losing himself. Staying feels like dying because it threatens the version of Rick that survives by escaping. But escape is not survival. It is postponement. Rick has mastered postponement so thoroughly that he mistakes it for freedom. He believes that as long as he is not trapped, he is alive. But life that exists only as movement lacks roots. Without roots, nothing grows. Rick avoids growth because growth requires staying, and staying still feels like death. Rick Sanchez lives surrounded by doors. Not literal doors, though those exist as well, sliding open with green light and the promise of elsewhere. The more important doors are conceptual, choices multiplied so far beyond necessity that no single one can hold meaning for very long. In Rick's multiverse, every outcome exists somewhere, and every mistake has an alternative version where it never happened. From the outside, this looks like freedom. From the inside, it feels like erosion. Infinite doors do not empower choice. They dissolve it. When every option is available, selection loses weight. Decision becomes temporary, provisional, reversible. Rick never chooses a path in the way most people do. He samples it, knowing that departure is always possible. This knowledge changes how he experiences reality. Choice for Rick is not commitment. It is experimentation. He does not ask which door he wants to walk through permanently. He asks which one is interesting enough to enter for now. If interest fades or consequence emerges, he leaves. This creates the illusion of agency while undermining its substance. Agency requires stakes. Stakes require limits. Infinite doors remove both. Rick's addiction to escape thrives in this environment because it reframes discomfort as inefficiency. If a choice leads to pain, it is not something to be endured or learned from. It is something to be abandoned. There is always another door where the same choice did not hurt. Rick internalizes this logic until it becomes reflex. He does not ask whether a door leads somewhere meaningful. He asks whether it remains tolerable. The moment it does not, he reaches for another handle. This constant availability of exit prevents depth from forming. Depth requires staying with a decision long enough for it to change you. Rick avoids being changed. Infinite doors also distort Rick's relationship with regret. Regret assumes finality. It requires acknowledging that something is lost and cannot be recovered. In Rick's multiverse, loss is rarely final. Another version exists where the loss did not occur. Rick does not mourn. He substitutes. This substitution feels efficient, but it hollows emotional experience. Grief processed through replacement never resolves. It lingers as numbness rather than pain. Rick does not carry sorrow cleanly because he never allows it to settle. He reroutes around it. Infinite doors make this rerouting effortless. But ease comes at a cost. When every door can be closed without consequence, none of them feel worth opening fully. Rick approaches experiences with detachment, anticipating departure from the start. He does not invest deeply because investment assumes risk, and risk is unnecessary when exit is guaranteed. This is why Rick's relationships feel transient, even when they last a long time. He is present, but not anchored. He participates, but does not commit. He remains half-turned toward the door. Infinite doors also reshape Rick's sense of responsibility. Responsibility requires continuity between action and outcome. When Rick leaves, that continuity breaks. The outcome belongs to the version of reality he abandoned, not to him. This mental separation allows him to act without fully inheriting the consequences. Rick does not see himself as irresponsible. He sees himself as mobile. Mobility becomes moral insulation. The more doors Rick has, the easier it is to justify leaving. Each departure feels less like abandonment and more like optimization. Why stay in a reality where things went wrong when a nearby one exists where they did not? This question erodes loyalty. Rick's loyalty is conditional on comfort. He remains only as long as circumstances align with his tolerance. The moment alignment fails, he reframes departure as rational choice rather than avoidance. Infinite doors support this narrative. They offer endless confirmation that leaving was correct. For every door Rick closes, there is another that opens smoothly, reinforcing the belief that escape solves problems rather than postponing them. But problems do not disappear. They recur. The same emotional dynamics follow Rick through different doors. The same patterns reemerge. He encounters familiar tensions in unfamiliar contexts, each time convinced that this version will be different. Each time, it isn't. Rick mistakes novelty for change. Infinite doors provide novelty endlessly. Change, however, requires staying long enough for friction to reshape behavior. Rick avoids friction by leaving. As a result, he accumulates experiences without integrating them. This accumulation creates exhaustion rather than growth. Rick is tired not because he has done too much, but because nothing ever settles. He carries countless beginnings without conclusions. His memory is cluttered with half-lived lives, abandoned moments, and unresolved attachments. Infinite doors prevent closure. Closure requires choosing one door and sealing the others. Rick cannot bring himself to do this because sealing doors feels like loss. Loss feels unnecessary when alternatives exist. But alternatives dilute significance. Rick ends up with everything and nothing at once. The illusion of infinite doors also distorts Rick's perception of time. Time becomes segmented rather than continuous. Rick experiences life in bursts between exits rather than as a flowing narrative. This segmentation allows him to survive extreme events without psychological collapse, but it also prevents accumulation of meaning. Meaning accumulates through continuity. Rick fragments continuity deliberately. This fragmentation keeps him agile, but empty. When Rick stands before infinite doors, he appears powerful. He controls access to realities, outcomes, and versions of himself. But this control is superficial. He controls entry and exit, not what happens when he stays. Staying would require him to close doors. Closing doors would require him to accept that some possibilities must die for others to live. Rick refuses this trade. Infinite doors also protect Rick from accountability to himself. As long as he can imagine a version of himself who made a different choice, he does not have to fully own the choice he made. He can always tell himself that another Rick handled it better. This externalization fragments responsibility. Rick disperses guilt across infinity until none of it feels heavy enough to confront. But dispersed guilt does not disappear. It becomes ambient, a background pressure that never resolves. This pressure contributes to Rick's self-destructive tendencies. When escape no longer provides relief, Rick escalates. He creates bigger problems, seeks stronger distractions, pushes further into chaos. Infinite doors lose their novelty over time. Each new door feels less distinct from the last. This is the paradox of infinite choice. Abundance creates indifference. Rick's addiction to escape is sustained by the illusion that each door represents a fresh start. In reality, each door is another variation of the same unresolved self. Rick carries himself through every portal unchanged by distance. The doors change. He does not. This is why infinite doors ultimately trap Rick more effectively than any prison. A prison has walls that can be challenged. Infinite doors remove the need to challenge anything. They offer relief without resolution. Rick confuses relief with freedom. Freedom requires commitment to consequences. Rick avoids both. The multiverse offers him endless exits, and he takes them, believing that motion itself is proof of autonomy. But autonomy without grounding becomes drift. Rick drifts through realities untethered, accumulating experience without meaning, choice without consequence. The doors never end. And because they never end, Rick never stops moving. The tragedy is not that Rick cannot find the right door. It is that no door can satisfy someone who refuses to stay on the other side long enough to belong there. Over time, behavior stops being something you do and becomes something you are. For Rick Sanchez, escape begins as a solution and ends as an identity. What once served a purpose gradually defines him, until the act of leaving is no longer a response to circumstances, but the core of how he understands himself. Rick does not describe himself as someone who escapes. He describes himself as someone who does not stay. The distinction matters. Escaping implies reaction, pressure, and urgency. Not staying implies choice, detachment, and control. Rick frames his departures as principled refusals rather than compulsions, as evidence of superiority rather than avoidance. This reframing protects his self-image. If escape is identity, then leaving is not failure. It is authenticity. Rick builds a narrative around motion. He tells himself that he is not afraid of commitment, only allergic to mediocrity. That he does not avoid responsibility, only inefficiency. That he does not run from pain, only from systems too fragile to survive contact with reality. Each explanation reinforces the same conclusion. Staying would compromise who he is. Identity solidifies around this belief. Rick begins to measure situations not by whether they are good or bad, but by whether they restrict his ability to leave. Environments that demand permanence feel hostile. Relationships that require consistency feel manipulative. Any structure that expects him to show up tomorrow becomes suspect. Rick experiences obligation as confinement. This perception alters how he behaves, even when escape is unnecessary. He preemptively destabilizes environments that feel too stable. He injects chaos into moments of calm. He mocks sincerity, undercuts intimacy, and reintroduces danger where safety might have allowed reflection. These actions are not random. They are maintenance behaviors. Rick maintains his identity by ensuring that staying is never required. If nothing is stable, then leaving remains justified. If nothing lasts, then departure is not abandonment. It is simply continuation. Escape becomes self-validation. Rick's intelligence accelerates this process. Because he can leave successfully so often, his identity is reinforced without challenge. He does not experience the consequences that would force reevaluation. His exits work. He survives. He finds stimulation elsewhere. Addiction deepens when consequences are absent. Rick also begins to equate stillness with weakness. Characters who remain in one place, who accept limits, who build lives around continuity rather than possibility, appear stagnant to him. He interprets their stability as resignation. In his mind, choosing to stay means choosing to be small. This belief distances him from others. Rick does not respect those who stay because staying contradicts the identity he has constructed. If staying is valid, then his leaving loses its moral justification. To protect his identity, Rick must believe that remaining is a failure of imagination or courage. Jerry Smith embodies this threat most clearly, but the pattern extends to everyone Rick encounters. Any form of rootedness is suspect. Any attachment is temporary by default. Rick's identity also reshapes his memory. He remembers exits more clearly than arrivals. Departures feel decisive and empowering. Arrivals blur together, interchangeable and forgettable. Over time, Rick's sense of self becomes tied to the act of leaving rather than the experiences he leaves behind. He defines himself by what he refuses to endure. This creates a hollow center. Identity built on avoidance requires constant reinforcement. Rick must keep moving to remain himself. The moment he pauses too long, cracks appear, doubt surfaces, questions emerge that cannot be outrun indefinitely. Who would he be if he stayed? What would remain if escape were unavailable? Which version of himself would survive continuity? Rick does not like these questions, so he leaves again. Escape as identity also distorts Rick's relationships with versions of himself. In a multiverse filled with alternate Ricks, identity becomes comparative. Rick defines himself against others who stayed too long, compromised too deeply, or failed to leave in time. He views those Ricks with contempt or pity. They serve as cautionary tales, reinforcing his own behavior. Each failed Rick confirms that escape is wisdom. Each stagnant Rick justifies his refusal to commit. Identity becomes competitive, measured by mobility rather than growth. Rick does not ask which Rick is happiest. He asks which Rick is least trapped. This metric shapes his decisions unconsciously. When faced with a choice between stability and motion, he chooses motion without deliberation. The decision feels automatic because it aligns with who he believes himself to be. At this stage, escape is no longer a choice. It is reflex. Rick's addiction has matured into character. This is why interventions fail. Arguments for staying sound naive to him. Appeals to responsibility feel manipulative. Suggestions of healing through presence feel dangerous. They threaten not just his habits, but his sense of self. Asking Rick to stay feels like asking him to die. Because if escape is identity, then stillness is annihilation. The tragedy is that identity forged around escape cannot experience fulfillment. Fulfillment requires duration. It requires seeing things through, allowing effort to compound, and accepting outcomes that cannot be replaced. Rick's life is rich in events, but poor in continuity. He accumulates moments without narrative. This fragmentation explains his persistent dissatisfaction. No matter how much he achieves, it does not cohere into meaning. He solves problems brilliantly, but the solutions evaporate when he leaves. He forms connections, but they dissolve when he moves on. Rick confuses intensity with significance. Escape as identity keeps his life intense. It does not make it meaningful. There are moments, rare, quiet moments, when Rick seems aware of this gap. When movement slows and the noise fades, he senses the emptiness beneath the motion. These moments are uncomfortable, dangerous to his self-concept. He does not linger. He escapes again. Rick Sanchez has built a self that survives by leaving. That self is strong, clever, and endlessly adaptable. It is also brittle because it cannot exist without motion. The day Rick cannot leave or chooses not to, the identity he has constructed will have to transform or collapse. Until then, escape remains who he is, not a habit, not a flaw, but a definition. Rick Sanchez rarely thinks about what remains after he leaves, not because he is incapable of imagining it, but because imagining it would require him to acknowledge continuity. It would mean accepting that time does not pause when he exits a room, a planet, or a universe. Things continue. People continue. The absence he creates becomes a presence of its own. Rick avoids this awareness deliberately. For Rick, leaving is an action with a clean edge. A portal opens. He steps through, and the world behind him is conceptually sealed off. The act feels complete. From his perspective, the situation is resolved the moment he is no longer inside it. For the people left behind, resolution does not occur. They inherit the aftermath. The people Rick leaves behind are not destroyed by his departure. That would be simpler. Destruction has finality. What Rick leaves is ambiguity. He leaves questions without answers, systems without maintenance, and relationships without closure. These are harder to live with. Rick's family experiences this most acutely. To them, Rick is both constant and unreliable. He returns often enough to remain central, but leaves often enough to prevent stability. His presence reshapes their lives, but his absence forces them to adapt repeatedly. This pattern creates a specific kind of damage. Not trauma in the conventional sense, but erosion. Expectations soften. Trust becomes provisional. Attachment is learned with an expiration date built in. The family learns, consciously or not, that Rick will not stay through discomfort. They adjust accordingly. They stop expecting consistency. They stop relying fully on his presence. They prepare for disappearance as part of normal life. Rick does not notice this adjustment. He experiences his returns as generosity, as evidence that he cares. He does not see how the intermittent nature of his presence prevents real repair. Each return resets hope briefly. Each departure reinforces disappointment. The cycle continues. For those left behind, Rick's escape becomes a lesson rather than an event. They learn that problems may be solved temporarily, but not sustained. That help arrives dramatically and leaves abruptly. That intimacy is possible but unreliable. This shapes behavior. Morty learns resilience through repetition. He stops reacting fully to loss because reacting would be exhausting. Exposure to Rick's exits teaches him that attachment must be managed carefully. The caring too much invites pain without guarantee of return. Beth learns to oscillate between closeness and distance. She seeks Rick's approval, but protects herself from dependence. She mirrors his behavior in smaller ways, leaving emotionally before being left physically. Jerry responds differently. He experiences Rick's departures as judgment. Each exit feels like confirmation that he is insufficient, that he failed to create an environment worth staying in. Rick's escape reinforces Jerry's insecurity even when Rick does not intend it to. Rick does not track these outcomes. He does not see the pattern because patterns require staying long enough to observe. Each time he leaves, he interrupts the narrative before consequences become visible. From his perspective, people adapt. Life goes on. The system remains functional. And it does. But functionality is not the same as health. Beyond the family, Rick leaves behind entire worlds altered by his presence. He introduces technologies that destabilize economies, solves problems that remove necessary pressures, and intervenes in systems without committing to their long-term balance. When he leaves, these systems wobble. Sometimes they recover. Sometimes they collapse. Sometimes they persist in distorted forms. Rick does not return to check. From his perspective, these worlds are no longer relevant. They were contexts for an action, not commitments. The fact that life continues inside them without him does not register as obligation. Rick's escape reframes responsibility as optional. He believes responsibility ends where presence ends. If he is not there, it is no longer his problem. This belief allows him to act decisively without being burdened by aftermath. But for those left behind, Rick's actions are not isolated events. They become histories. People build stories around his arrival and departure. They interpret his exits as abandonment, strategy, or divine indifference. They reorganize their lives around the absence of someone who briefly mattered immensely and then vanished. Rick becomes mythic not because of what he does, but because of how he leaves. His exits are abrupt, unceremonious, and often final. He does not explain. He does not prepare others for continuity without him. He assumes adaptation will occur naturally. It usually does. Adaptation, however, is not free. it costs trust. When Rick leaves people behind, he teaches them that reliance is dangerous, that help comes with strings of unpredictability, that solutions may arrive without warning and disappear just as quickly. This lesson spreads quietly. It shapes how others treat each other. They become more cautious, more self-reliant, less willing to build systems that depend on intervention. Rick's presence and absence ripple outward, encouraging a culture of provisional attachment. Rick never intended this, but intention does not erase impact. Rick's addiction to escape also deprives others of closure. Closure requires explanation, acknowledgement, and finality. Rick provides none of these. He leaves before conversations finish, before conflicts resolve, before understanding can form. The people left behind are forced to invent their own endings. They tell themselves stories to fill the gap Rick leaves. Some imagine he left for good reasons. Others assume fault. Some refuse to think about it at all. These narratives allow them to move forward, but they are built on absence rather than truth. Rick never corrects them. He does not see value in doing so. From his perspective, explaining himself would create attachment. Attachment would create expectation. Expectation would create obligation. Obligation would make leaving harder next time. Rick avoids this spiral by leaving cleanly. The cost of this cleanliness is borne entirely by others. Rick's addiction to escape also isolates him further. Each departure weakens the threads that connect him to others. Over time, he becomes less embedded in any single context. He is known everywhere and belonged nowhere. The people left behind change. Rick remains the same. This asymmetry creates distance that cannot be closed by return alone. Even when Rick comes back, the relationship is altered. Time has passed unevenly. Others have processed events Rick skipped. They carry memories Rick avoided. Rick notices the distance but misinterprets it. He assumes people have moved on. He reads emotional caution as indifference. He does not see that his repeated escapes taught them to protect themselves. Rick's presence becomes destabilizing rather than comforting. He enters environments that have adapted without him and disrupts the equilibrium. His return reintroduces chaos, only to vanish again, forcing another round of adjustment. This pattern exhausts those left behind. But Rick is not there to witness the exhaustion. He leaves before fatigue becomes visible. The people Rick leaves behind are not angry in a dramatic way. Anger would require engagement. Instead, they become resigned. They expect departure. They plan around absence. They lower the emotional stakes to survive unpredictability. This quiet resignation is Rick's true legacy, not destruction, not innovation, but the normalization of abandonment. Rick teaches others unintentionally that stability is temporary and that reliance is risky. This lesson spreads wherever he goes, shaping relationships long after he has left. Rick could stop this. He could stay long enough to repair. He could explain. He could accept responsibility for aftermath. He could acknowledge the people he leaves behind as more than collateral. But doing so would require him to confront the damage of his addiction. And confronting damage requires staying. So Rick leaves again. And the people left behind continue living in the space he vacated, adapting to an absence that feels permanent even when it isn't. They carry forward, shaped by a presence that never quite stayed long enough to be fully known. Rick moves on. They remain. There comes a point where escape stops working. Not suddenly and not dramatically, but gradually, in ways that are easy to ignore if you keep moving fast enough. For Rick Sanchez, this moment does not arrive as a crisis. It arrives as fatigue. The portals still open, the exits still function, the multiverse still offers infinite alternatives. But the relief Rick once felt when leaving begins to thin. Like air at high altitude, he escapes and nothing changes. Rick expects escape to reset his internal state the way it once did. A new universe, a new problem, a new distraction. These things used to be enough. They provided stimulation, novelty, and distance from whatever discomfort had begun to surface. But over time, novelty loses its edge. The universes blur together. The problems repeat themselves with different aesthetics. Rick starts to notice the repetition. Not consciously at first. He just feels less satisfied, less relieved. He leaves situations that should have felt urgent, only to find himself restless immediately afterward. The escape happens, but the pressure remains. This is the moment addiction enters its final stage. Escape no longer numbs. Rick's movements become compulsive rather than strategic. He leaves not because leaving solves anything, but because staying feels unbearable even when escape no longer helps. The behavior persists without reward. Rick does not slow down to examine this. He escalates. When escape fails to deliver relief, Rick increases intensity, bigger dangers, louder chaos, more extreme situations. He seeks experiences strong enough to overwhelm what he is feeling. He throws himself into conflict, intoxication, and intellectual challenge, hoping that sheer stimulation will drown out the noise. It does not. The multiverse cannot distract him from himself anymore. Rick's problem is no longer situational. It is internal. And internal problems do not respect portals. No matter where Rick goes, he arrives with the same unresolved weight. The same patterns of behavior reassert themselves quickly. The same emotional distance forms. The same dissatisfaction creeps in once the initial rush fades. Rick realizes dimly and unwillingly that escape is no longer preventative. It is reactive. He is no longer leaving to avoid pain. He is leaving because pain has already arrived, and he does not know what else to do with it. This distinction matters. Avoidance implies foresight. Reaction implies loss of control. Rick hates losing control. Escape without relief also changes Rick's relationship to time. Previously, leaving felt like a reset. Now it feels like delay. He knows, even if he refuses to articulate it, that whatever he is avoiding will still be there when the noise fades. This awareness breeds cynicism. Rick becomes sharper, more caustic, more dismissive. His humor darkens. His patience thins. He lashes out more quickly, not because others have changed, but because his internal buffer is gone. Escape no longer replenishes it. He is tired, not physically, but existentially. Rick's intelligence keeps offering solutions, but none of them address the core problem. He can build, destroy, manipulate, and transcend, but he cannot generate relief through motion anymore. The mechanism that sustained him for so long has lost effectiveness. This terrifies him. Because if escape cannot save him, then nothing he relies on can. Rick does not articulate this fear. He buries it under behavior. He drinks more. He destabilizes environments more aggressively. He provokes situations that justify leaving even faster. These actions create the illusion of agency, but they are increasingly hollow. Escape becomes maintenance rather than medicine. Rick's family notices the shift, even if they cannot name it. His departures feel sharper. His returns feel heavier. He is present but not rested. The old rhythm, chaos, escape, return, loses coherence. Something is wrong, but no one can confront it directly because Rick never stays long enough to be confronted. And even if he did, he would not listen. Rick's addiction to escape has reached the point where it sustains itself without benefit. He leaves because leaving is what he does. The behavior persists even when the payoff is gone. This is the quiet truth of addiction. It continues long after it stops helping. Rick senses this and resents it. He resents the multiverse for failing to distract him. He resents himself for needing distraction. He resents the idea that something inside him might require attention rather than avoidance. Attention requires staying. Staying is the one thing he still refuses. Escape without relief forces Rick into a narrowing corridor. He can escalate endlessly, chasing diminishing returns, or he can confront what escape has been protecting him from. Both paths are painful. One is familiar, the other is unknown. Rick chooses familiarity. But familiarity is no longer comforting. Each escape feels thinner than the last. Each new universe feels less distinct. Each departure feels less like freedom and more like obligation. Rick is not running toward anything anymore. He is running because stopping feels worse. This is the exhaustion beneath the genius. Rick Sanchez, the man who can leave anything, discovers that there is one thing he cannot outrun: the accumulation of a life lived without rest. Escape kept him alive. It kept him functional. It kept him moving. It did not keep him whole. The multiverse offers him infinite exits, but none of them lead to relief anymore. They only extend the distance between him and the moment he will eventually have to face. The moment where escape fails completely, and something else must take its place. And in that imbalance, the true cost of escape quietly accumulates. Eventually, even for Rick Sanchez, motion reaches a limit. Not because the multiverse runs out of places, but because escape stops producing distance. The portals still open. The coordinates still exist. The alternatives remain infinite. And yet, Rick finds that every place he arrives feels strangely familiar, as if the journey has folded back on itself. There is nowhere left to go that feels new. This is not a physical boundary. It is an internal one. Rick reaches a point where leaving no longer changes the shape of his experience. He escapes, and the same quiet weight settles in again, unchanged by distance or novelty. The environments differ, the problems vary, but the feeling remains constant, unmoved by relocation. For the first time, Rick cannot outrun continuity. This is the moment he has been avoiding his entire life. Rick has always believed that staying creates pain, and that leaving dissolves it. When leaving stops working, the equation breaks. Pain is no longer something that belongs to a place or a situation. It is something Rick carries with him. Wherever he goes, he arrives intact. This realization is subtle and deeply unsettling. Rick does not experience it as insight or clarity. He experiences it as discomfort without cause, a restlessness that no longer points outward, a dissatisfaction that refuses to be solved by action. For someone whose identity is built on escape, this is disorienting. Rick has always defined freedom as movement. Now movement feels meaningless. This does not lead to sudden transformation. Rick does not stop leaving overnight. Habits built over lifetimes do not dissolve cleanly. Instead, his escapes become smaller, less dramatic. Sometimes he does not leave at all, not because he has chosen to stay, but because leaving feels pointless. Stillness begins to creep in, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that removes distraction. In these moments, Rick is forced into proximity with himself. Without urgency, without crisis, without an external reason to flee, he encounters the accumulation of everything he avoided. The grief that was never processed, the guilt that was never owned, the loneliness that was never named. These things do not attack him. They wait. Rick discovers that nowhere left to go does not mean confinement. It means exposure. He is exposed to continuity, to memory, to the fact that his life has shape even if he refused to acknowledge it. This shape is uneven. It is full of abandoned threads, unresolved relationships, and choices that were never reconciled with their outcomes. Rick has lived as if departure erased responsibility. Now he sees that responsibility persists without him, accumulating quietly until it can no longer be ignored. Rick's instinct is still to escape, but escape has lost its power. This is not punishment, it is consequence. For the first time, Rick confronts the possibility that escape was never freedom, only delay. That motion kept him functional, not healed. That leaving allowed him to survive without ever learning how to live with what survival required. Now, survival is no longer the question. Presence is. Rick does not suddenly become gentle or reflective. He does not confess, repent, or transform into something recognizably whole. That would be dishonest to who he is. Instead, he becomes quieter, less performative. The sharpness remains, but it loses urgency. He stops escalating as often, not because he has found peace, but because escalation no longer distracts him. Rick begins to experience time differently. Without constant departure, moments stretch, days feel longer, consequences linger. This is uncomfortable, but it is also grounding. For the first time, Rick experiences duration without interruption. Duration is where meaning lives. This does not make him happy, but it makes him real. The family notices the change, even if they cannot explain it. Rick is still unreliable, still dangerous, still brilliant. But something in him has slowed. His exits are less frequent, his returns less dramatic. He does not announce his presence as loudly. He is still there. Rick does not explain this shift. He would not know how. Explanation would require narrative, and Rick has avoided narrative his entire life. He lives in fragments. Beginnings without endings, solutions without aftermath. Now fragments begin to connect, not into redemption, into coherence. Rick starts to understand, not intellectually but viscerally, that staying does not kill him. It hurts. It exposes him. It forces him to sit with discomfort that escape once kept at bay. But it does not annihilate him. The fear that staying equals death begins to loosen, just slightly. This is the most dangerous moment of all, because it opens the possibility that escape was never the only option. Rick does not fully accept this possibility. Acceptance would require surrendering the identity he built around leaving. But the seed is planted. Doubt enters the space where certainty once lived. Doubt is uncomfortable, but it is also fertile. When there is nowhere left to go, Rick faces a choice he has never practiced making. Not which universe to enter, but whether to remain present in the one he is already in. Not whether to act, but whether to endure. Endurance is not Rick's strength, but it may be his next lesson. Rick Sanchez will never become someone who stays easily. His instincts are too deeply carved, his habits too reinforced. Escape will always tempt him. Portals will always beckon. The multiverse will always offer exits. But something has shifted. Rick now knows that leaving does not erase what he carries. That motion cannot solve internal fracture. That some problems are not problems of location, they are problems of presence. When there is nowhere left to go, Rick is left with the one thing he has avoided more skillfully than any enemy or obstacle: himself. This is not resolution, it is beginning. Rick Sanchez stands at the edge of a life he has never lived, not because it is extraordinary, but because it requires staying. It requires letting time do its work. It requires accepting that some pain cannot be optimized away. The multiverse remains infinite. Rick remains capable of leaving. But for the first time, escape is no longer the only thing that defines him. And in that quiet, uncomfortable stillness, something unfamiliar takes shape. Not peace, not redemption, but the possibility of a life that does not need to run forever.